This morning what I'd like to do is share with you the office's review of an officer-involved shooting in Mesa in December of last year. The purpose in doing this is twofold. And actually before I get going any further, I want to underscore the fact that this particular shooting resulted in the loss of life. And for Mr. Krstic and his family, this certainly is a tragedy, and I don't want to let that go unrecognized. And I'm certainly well aware of that, regardless of what the outcome might otherwise be. In this particular instance, what we have is a situation where the investigation is completed, a charging decision has been made to not file criminal charges, and therefore the video will be released and will be available for viewing by the public. This is an instance too in which the body-worn camera video provides a significant piece of evidence, but in viewing it, prosecutors still had additional questions and further investigation was necessary. And when I show you the video and walk you through an overall review of the shooting, it'll become apparent why there were additional questions and why we asked for more information. The Mesa Police Department was cooperative. Our officer-involved shooting protocol was followed exactly as expected in this particular incident. And so we're confident that a thorough investigation was done, the information that we asked for was provided, and we were able to reach, again, that charging decision. In this particular incident, Mesa police were called to the Los Angeles community in Mesa. Officers responded at approximately 9:52 in the evening, and this followed 3 phone calls to 911. One caller who'd had direct contact with Mr. Krstic called in and provided details about the nature of that contact and sort of a characterization of the conversation that they had, and also provided information that subsequently was confirmed that Mr. Krstic had had previous contacts with the Mesa Police Department, to include a standoff with SWAT involving a weapon and a lockdown of the elementary school in the Los Angeles community. One of the 2 responding officers knew that information when he got there, and a CAD printout of the information that was sent to the officers en route to the scene confirms that the information about that standoff was known to Officer Grancy. When the officers first get to the scene too, and Officer Grancy gets out of his car, he can see a fellow neighbor in that community moving away from Mr. Krstic with the neighbor's dog. That, combined with the other information that he knew when he got there, as well as that first interaction with Mr. Krstic, sets the scene for what is going to follow. Now, what I'm going to do with the video too is I'm going to play it for you up until the point when the shooting occurs. Obviously, it's going to be graphic, and again, I want to underscore the fact that the result of this interaction is the loss of life. I'm going to stop it after Mr. Krstic goes down to the ground. The video goes on afterwards, but there's no purpose for me to play that, because everything that happens afterwards is not important for the criminal charging review. Then I'll talk you through some of the information that we asked for and what was provided, and then I'll play it again at the end to the same point for you. I don't have the technical means to do a frame-by-frame analysis this morning. There are also some levels of detail for questions that you may ask that I'm simply not qualified to provide, and rather than give an imperfect answer, I'll just refer you to investigators with the Mesa Police Department on that. But I will answer as much as I can, as fully as I can. So again, to set the stage for you, it's about 9:52 in the evening on December 3rd of last year. We've had multiple calls come in to 911. I should also tell you that the other 2 911 calls, one of them was of a mother who had retreated to her bathroom with her children. She was in fear, believing that there was someone out in the neighborhood firing a gun. As it turns out, those were actually incidents of Mr. Krstic pounding the pavement with the steel pole that he had. And then a third call came in from a person who had employees in the Los Angeles community who provide services to that community, wondering whether or not there was a dangerous situation underway and if he needed to be concerned about his employees. So that sort of forms the other aspects to the scene as it unfolds. You're not going to hear sound for a bit because the Axon camera has a 30-second delay. This is Officer Grancy. Officer Glover did not have a camera on. That's Mr. Krstic in the background.
Bar down. Drop the bar. Drop the metal bar. One more time. Nice, 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 nice. Stay down. Get down. Get down. Get down.
The first viewing of that video at this point, some of you may have a conclusion about what it looks like. I'll share with you that after initially reviewing the video, we had more questions and asked for further follow-up from law enforcement. That follow-up had to deal with the distances involved, the timing of the taser deployment, the reaction of Mr. Krstic to that taser deployment and what officers were perceiving at that point in time, and what was the nature of the knife that you can hear the other Mesa officer who was responsible for the less lethal deployment of the taser. Where was that? What could they see? The one point that I want to make here too is that, and this is something that I talked about previously when body-worn cameras were starting to be deployed, that there are differences between the camera's field of view and ability to collect information and then what the individual police officer may be focusing on or looking at, and that discrepancy between human vision and human processing and the camera's ability to take in information at times can be problematic for what we otherwise think in a hindsight review easily shows or easily provides. And one example of that is going to be the knife. From the field of view of the camera and where Officer Grancy is initially looking, it may not have been in his field of vision unless and until Officer Glover then identifies that a knife came out. And then Officer Grancy is aware of that. The diagram that is up on the screen right now is also a reflection of additional information that was requested by the office to help assess and determine whether or not the use of force was permissible under Arizona law. At the very top of the scene diagram, and these distances are approximate because we also asked investigators to go back and try to give us a more definite distance measurement at various points, and I'll share those with you. When you look at the bottom of the scene diagram under the measurements, the last bullet point states distance between Officer Grancy and the witness when he got out of his vehicle was 25 feet. That's the witness that I referred to earlier who had a contact with Mr. Krstic and then was walking away from that contact with his dog. The distance between Officer Glover and Mr. Krstic when the taser was deployed was 10 feet. Officer Grancy is just a little bit to the side and ahead of Officer Glover when the knife comes out. You have the initial contact at roughly 28 feet, and Mr. Krstic had closed that distance too, which is evident in watching the video. And in that instance, the video is helpful in helping us understand what the officers are perceiving and the actions of Mr. Krstic leading up to the point where he's initially tased. There's a failure to comply. He's continuing to carry what is approximately 3-foot spiked steel pole that's used to set forms for concrete on construction sites. And why is that significant too? He was using it to remove manhole covers. So it's not the rebar that was initially reported by some of the fellow citizen witnesses. And then the second point of analysis is when he gets tased and he goes down to the ground. That's an initial reaction, but the taser doesn't have the expected effect on Mr. Krstic because he does pull a knife. And we do have, well, that's the steel pole. and then there's the knife itself. The silver color of the knife at night with the flashlights and street lighting has a dramatic effect in being well visible when it is pulled, at the same time that Mr. Krstic is pulling the barbs out of his body. Not to be overly graphic, but the deployment of those barbs, one entered into the front above the midline of the body, but the second one hit him in the groin area. For most men in this room, just threatening to strike the groin area may cause you to react. And there appeared to be no reaction there, where the barb actually penetrated his clothing and hit him in the groin area. So we've got those three now moments: the moment of not complying and continuing to present a threat to law enforcement as he's approaching with the steel bar in light of previous law enforcement contacts. The second being the deployment of the taser and trying to remove the barbs and then pulling out a knife. The next moment then is him getting back up. Now, when you watch the video the first time, it appears that Mr. Krstic may be moving away from the officers. That initial appearance was one of the reasons why we wanted more investigation, and we also took a look at other civilian statements and other information from an objective forensic viewpoint to try to assess what were Mr. Krstic's movements and what was going on at that point. Now, I don't know how easy it is for you to see, but what we were able to determine from the point of where Mr. Krstic was tased and the knife then was dropped to where shots were fired and Mr. Krstic went down, it is about a 45-degree angle, but over the course of walking that 45-degree angle and continuing to move, he's closing the distance between himself and Officer Grancy. Closing that distance in light of all the previous actions is a continuing threat then for the officer. And Mr. Krstic then picked that metal pole back up when he got up from where he had been tased. So now you've got to factor in someone who had a previous violent interaction or possible violent interaction with SWAT, with negative effects of the taser, and continuing to get up then and grabbing that steel pole and continue to advance towards the officer. All those factors together then support an assessment by a police officer that Mr. Krstic is an ongoing threat and continuing to move towards him, such that when the decision is made to fire, and human factors experts were also brought in the frame-by-frame review to try to assess when the decision to fire was made, for us as prosecutors to be able to review what were the totality of the circumstances and information available to the police officer at that moment. And it's a critical moment for the review too, in order for us to be able to conclude that criminal charges shouldn't be filed here because of the nature of the threat presented. Again, the one thing I want to underscore is that when we watch that video, it happens rather quickly. And doing the frame-by-frame review after the fact certainly allows us more time to identify everything that the camera captured, but not necessarily to be able to appreciate how that's being processed by the officer at that particular moment. Ultimately then, the decision to fire and the two shots that are fired occur where Mr. Krstic is approximately 7 feet away from Officer Grancy. Consistent with law enforcement training and other studies that have been performed and use of force experts have relied on, once someone gets within 10 feet and an officer has not made a decision to do anything, being able to immediately react to handle the situation is sometimes extremely difficult and can result in significant injury, and depending upon what weapon a subject might have, could result in loss of life. In this particular instance, where the decision to fire is made, Mr. Krstic is roughly, as I said, about 7 feet away. He has a 3-foot metal pole. One quick step, one quick swing is the threat that Officer Grancy perceives. Make sure that I covered everything for you to this point. So the evidence that we specifically asked for, in addition to the video, which was just a starting point for prosecutors, it wasn't the concluding point, had to deal with the diagram of the scene, the distances involved, and then statements from witnesses, as well as a review of the 911 calls and what other people were perceiving at the time, and the previous law enforcement contacts that Mr. Krstic had had within that community. We did do a frame-by-frame review with experts, looking specifically at Mr. Krstic's position, actions, law enforcement commands, law enforcement actions, Mr. Krstic's reactions, and then decisions to deal with the threat as it was presented. Again, at the end of the day, this interaction ended with the loss of life, which is tragic for Mr. Krstic and his family, and that fact shouldn't be lost. But in reviewing the totality of what we could find, in reviewing the video and objective information involving forensic evidence at the scene, our officer-involved shooting protocol being followed, and a thorough review by prosecutors at the end of the day, the conclusion is that these actions are permissible under Arizona law, and we will not be filing a criminal charge in this particular case. That's the specific information that I wanted to share with you. What questions do you have? No, that particular assessment didn't occur, Joe. Officer Grancy in the video, and I tell you what, let me play it one more time, and then I can address your specific question. Here, let me set this up. I'm going to stop it again at the same point. And listen for the audible warning of the knife too, and I think that'll address your question in part. The short answer is no, he did not say he thought it was a gun at that moment. He never said he thought it was a gun.
Bar down! Drop the bar. Drop the metal bar. One more time. Nice, 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 nice. Stay down! Get down! Get down! Get down!
When you see that small flash of silver, that's when the knife has come out. And it was only when we did the frame-by-frame review too that we were also able to see that there was a shadow of that knife that gets caught in one of the extreme fields of view of that camera. But obviously you've got Officer Grancy moving forward, presumably to be able to take the suspect into custody for the incident up until that point. And it's when Officer Glover then identifies that Mr. Krstic's pulled the knife out, but then Officer Grancy steps back in the direction towards his police car and back away from Mr. Krstic, and then he holds his position, and that's when you have the further movement, which, you know, the perception is it looks like Mr. Krstic may be moving away, but at that 45-degree angle, and based on the additional information we were able to determine from what scene investigators and their measurements could provide, he's actually closing the distance. I think that answers your question, Joe.
So, what of the firing officer has the crucial for you deciding justified shot?
Well, it was more his description of what he saw when he got out of the car and the interactions with Mr. Krstic. He does confirm in his interview that he was concerned for his own safety and that of Officer Glover. That independently, though, that's not enough. We've got to then take a look at what we're able to see. And this is where, again, to underscore it, the video here was helpful, but it wasn't conclusive. What the officer says in terms of it matching up with the video and where Mr. Krstic was at and what Mr. Krstic's actions were, in conjunction with the other information that we had from witnesses, citizen witnesses who were in the neighborhood, puts together the picture for us to be able to conclude that the movements were a continuing threat after everything else that had happened, and that the decision to shoot was permissible under Arizona law. Yeah.
Why do this today? Why did you want to show the video? Why did you want to get the word out in this way?
I'm well aware of the other events that have occurred in our community. We had planned to do this today over a week ago, given respective schedules and having some last-minute questions answered. The main reason, as I said at the outset, is that this is an instance in which we have video. The video doesn't answer all the questions, so it allows me to share with you in the community that the video sometimes is a starting point for prosecutors, but it's not the end point. And so we also will rely on objective forensic information, the scene diagram, the measurements, and the totality of all the circumstances for us to be able to reach a conclusion. Obviously, given other events that have happened within our community, the timing today is not the most advantageous. The other part to this is that once I communicate the charging decision to the Mesa Police Department, which has been done, this video will be made public. And if I wait for people to view the video and then raise their own questions, we lose the opportunity as a criminal justice system to be able to explain what we looked at and why certain aspects were important, and other components in the initial review raised more questions than provided answers. So I could wait for all of that to happen. I could wait for the next standing press conference, but between now and then, where there could be speculation and questions about that decision-making process, it's far better and I think easier for people to understand the decision that was made for me to be proactive in sharing this information and addressing questions now.
There's a whole mood out there in police shootings that officers are being too aggressive. Is the goal here to try to counter that so that this doesn't get painted as a situation where a shooting is up in the air and the community is upset?
That might be a natural consequence of doing this. I look at it more from the standpoint of, if I want the community to know what's happening within these various incidents, then it's my responsibility to provide the information. Obviously, law enforcement in my office works very hard to try to maintain strong community interaction and strong community relations. And I think over the course of certainly the last several months, the community has seen that where we have questions about shootings, we deal with them accordingly. And I think this would fit within that continuum too, that where we're presented with even video, that's not going to be the end of the analysis. We still want to see what else is going on in order for us to be able to draw a conclusion, and what objective forensic evidence might we have to support a decision one way or the other. So that's sort of the explanation for you. Andrew, I would say the short answer is that I've always sought, as the county attorney in dealing with matters involving law enforcement, that where I can provide information, I want to do it, because I want to help with understanding in the community and not necessarily try to drive a particular message with an expected reaction, but rather to provide the information and then address concerns and questions as they arise afterwards.
The police officers that I've talked to over the years have always said that in a situation like this, if they perceive a threat, then it's almost always kind of waiting to not have to face any charges in the shooting. You hear that in every situation, even the Brailsford one, that they perceived a threat. What do you say? What makes this threat different from, say, the Brailsford case or any other case? I mean, not a direct comparison, just generally speaking. What about the threat here made it so much worse than other situations?
Well, you understand, I can't do a direct comparison.
I know you can't.
And with these sorts of incidents too, we try not to do a comparison at all, because the circumstances in each one of these incidents are very unique and specific to what's happening at the time. You know, what we've got right here is that what I will share with you, if all we had initially was Mr. Krstic advancing towards law enforcement and refusing to comply with commands and continue to come at them with the steel bar in his hand, depending upon what the officer said in his continuing advance at that point, that might have been a moment where the use of deadly force could have been justified. Following that point, where he then was tased and produced a knife, lethal force at that point could have been deemed to be justified in conjunction with trying to remove the barbs. I mean, one of the things that I want to underscore here too is that the first interaction between law enforcement was verbal and trying to get him to comply and drop the pole, and that didn't happen. And then when the deployment of less lethal means is conducted and there's no reaction, that then presents law enforcement in my review as a prosecutor with a very different set of circumstances, because now you've had law enforcement try to encourage and command compliance and then use a less lethal means of force, which, you know, whenever possible, I think we want to see, whenever possible, didn't have the outcome expected. And then, and I should add, if I didn't earlier, say there was that imminent threat and that under Arizona law the use of deadly force was justified. To the broader point, are there magic words that if law enforcement uses automatically means that we're going to come to a conclusion to not file criminal charges? No. No. I mean, Joe's earlier point about statements that the officer made, was that dispositive in this? No, it wasn't. You know, the officer could have said all along, I felt threatened, but if you've got a subject that's walking towards them with hands up and no perceived weapon, no history, no 911 calls, that's going to be a very different analysis with a likely different outcome. Other questions?
You're saying it appears he's sort of shuffling away. That's actually people that he's actually looking out for.
Correct. Joe, if you look up here, yeah. So, yeah, when you look up here, the distance is roughly 16 feet between Mr. Krstic and Officer Grancy. And Officer Grancy does retreat back to this area after Mr. Krstic gets up. And Mr. Krstic's path is roughly a 45-degree path, but it's continuing to close the distance between himself and Officer Grancy, so that the point, this particular measurement right here was an approximate one. We asked for a more definitive measurement, and investigators came back and said the actual distance at that point then where Officer Grancy makes a decision to fire is more like 7 feet there. So that's a problem with the video, where it appears that the distance is increasing, and instead, because of the angle of approach and the peculiarities of the video equipment, angle, and this is where really, this is that moment where I say my expertise in it isn't satisfactory to get into the technical aspects of it. But the reality is that at that point when Officer Grancy fires, the distance is closed. And so the perception that Mr. Krstic is moving away is an inaccurate perception of the video at that point, and instead the distance is much smaller. And I'll tell you that that's what initially drove the request for the additional information. We couldn't just look at the video and be able to draw a conclusion from that. We needed more. We wanted to understand what were the distances at each of the different interactions and what was Mr. Krstic doing, and the additional information from citizens in the neighborhood. where it's important to be careful in viewing the video, that at that particular angle, in the moment that a decision is made to fire, the ability to swing around with that bar is present. You don't have to be squared up with someone in order to have the ability to use a 3-foot metal bar. In terms of the barbs, and from watching the video, it appears he's able to disconnect the top barb. Officer Glover, nonetheless, does try to activate it again, and it's ineffective. Any other questions? Yes. And again, I think the length of it is right about 3 feet, and it's a heavy steel bar used for setting concrete forms at construction sites. And the sound of the bar striking the pavement was such that it caused one woman to retreat to her bathroom with her kids and call 911, concerned that someone was firing a weapon in the neighborhood. Are there any other questions? Additional questions about the particular resources or tactics available at that point, I think, are better answered by the Mesa Police Department. I don't want to speculate, and for purposes of our criminal review, that wasn't a factor. Yes, sir.
Did they at any time know that he was working? Did they realize that he was working at the time?
I'm sorry, I don't understand. Working?
Yeah, I mean, he was using that pole, he was working that pole. Did they at any time realize that he was actually at work, even though they...
I have no information to support that assertion. He lived in the neighborhood. There's no information from anyone that he was quote-unquote working. His behavior up until the point when people actually started to call 911 was very erratic. And I have no information to suggest that using that pole to try to lift manhole covers was any legitimate work in the sense of him having authorization to do that. Yes, sir.
Did he have a history of mental illness? And if so, were officers aware of that going into this in any means?
Subsequent to the incident and information provided by family members, he did have a mental health history. Whether or not officers knew that going in, there's no information that we had to review. There's no information evident in the CAD printout either that includes mental health history information. And that would actually be part of a much broader conversation about our behavioral health system and what can be done in trying to provide treatment to people. There's a pretty lengthy history there, and out of respect for Mr. Krstic's privacy, I don't think I can get into it, but that's the best answer I can give you.
I don't know. Can you play that video one more time? I've got a little clear on my camera.
I know you're going to be mad at me, but I'm not going to play it again at this point in time. It will be provided for the media, and I'll refer you to the Mesa Police Department for that. They're the custodian of the records, and I'll leave it to them to do that. Any other questions?
Do you know how long the officer Grancy has been on the job?
I don't. It's part of the information that was submitted to us for review. I just don't recall it off the top of my head.
How do you spell his first name?
I'm going to refer you to the Mesa Police Department for the specifics on the officers involved. I'll leave it at that. Any other questions? Again, I want to underscore the fact that regardless of the circumstances here, this ended with the loss of life, and Mr. Krstic's family, I'm sure, is continuing to grieve, and this in no way our decision is meant to be a comment about their loss or meant to diminish at all how much Mr. Krstic meant to his loved ones. Thank you.